decision making and say, where are we? This isn't a matter of identifying a list of men's topics that should be researched, although I will mention some of those. It's more a matter of saying that we have media attention, deliberation, development of public opinion, development of policies, a range of beliefs that people hold. Where is this coming from? Is it coming from research? What is the existing research? Is that going into the policy making and public debate? What is the media picking up on? And where are our beliefs coming from? And a major aspect of that, being an economist as well, and I tell my postgrad research methods students, they're not just trying to find efficiency in the areas they're researching, they should be efficient in their research. We have a limited number of people and a limited amount of time to look into these issues. Therefore, when we're looking into them, we should choose the topics and the approaches very carefully, and we should also be concerned as to how the information is then being transmitted. So, go fairly quickly. What sort of, we'll be looking at what sort of information might be available, how is it being used, and also the issue, and I think it's a very important one that's often overlooked, the dissemination of information. When things are known, do they actually get into debate, or are they suppressed, or are they ignored? Are we actually using the information we already have? Now, what I'll do, okay. Also for background, because this is a men's thing, in another month there's something looking at women, and so there's so much segmentation of society and analysis. My view is, and also as an academic, if you're trying to understand these issues, are men's issues completely separate from the rest of society? Are women's issues completely separate from the rest of society? If our lives are all intertwined and interdependent, we cannot analyse them in isolation. And so much of the research that's actually being done, so much in particular feminist research, you go to a conference and say, why are you just looking at women on this? Well, that's the area I'm interested in. Can they actually understand it properly? And will we get a balanced view when people are researching like that? So we should be aware of the interrelationships in all that sort of analysis. Okay, so having mentioned that, I'll just tap on it. In another month, there's a women's convention coming up. It's revisiting something that they had 30 years ago. The same people will be going to it, and there's a whole range of issues being raised. Now, in our local paper in Palmerston North, there was a brief newspaper clipping about this a while ago, saying what it's about. It started off with a sentence, why are women still doing almost all the work in the fields, offices, and home? That was the start of the article. We have had a time use survey done in New Zealand. There's a long argument and debate as to why the government should spend $2 million on a time use survey, because we are understating the amount of work women do. What did it find? In the finding of the study, on average, men did 2 hours more paid work, women did 2 hours more unpaid work. In other words, the finding of the study that was done, and this was released in 1999, said there isn't this big imbalance. You still saw on TV just the other day someone from CTU talking about women's double burden, all the extra hours they're working. The data on aggregate do not show this. And if you take smaller groups, if they're equal on average, if you find for some smaller groups, women are doing more work than the men, there will be other groups where men are doing more work than the women. Okay? We know that. We have known that for at least 6 years, and I'd argue there's data already before that saying that was the case. Yet even now, for the Women's Convention, they are promoting that view. This is straight misinformation. The research has been done, we spent $2 million on it, and we're still believing, or we're still being told that. Now, for this convention, it's not just a group of women. There's close links to government. The Action Plan for New Zealand Women, again, a gendered approach, launched in 2004 by the Ministry of Women's Affairs, is a base document for the convention. So we really have to ask, at this convention, are the right questions going to be asked in the right way? Are you going to get the right information coming in? And what significance will that have on policy directions in New Zealand? Now, there was actually, in August last year, a media release about this. There's some very interesting things in that release. Just to quote, to quote from this release, sorry, it mentions such things as the Convention will most particularly look at the situations of young women today, ... to identify achievable policy objectives to accommodate the changing needs of women and men. So they're looking at young women to identify the needs of women and men. Can you do that? Does that make sense as research? Does that make sense as a policy-based forum to look at things in that way? I don't see it. Anyway, the release went on to say something which is actually quite puzzling, but what they're trying to do, well, it's already puzzling, but they wanted to align women's achievements and aspirations with the country's social and economic development. Now, there's actually something a bit more sinister about that. Are they actually trying to manipulate women into doing what a certain group want them to do? But also, and this is where you hear talk, what is the social engineering going on? Are we actually being fed a line as to where society is and where it should be going? But also, why is it just women's achievements and aspirations? Can you actually separate out young women's aspirations and young men's aspirations if they're going to be forming lives together and bringing up children and so on? Can we actually do that? It suggests that we have, in this, I would suggest very probably a highly major convention that's going to get a lot of publicity. It's taking a narrow perspective that excludes men. It may not consider the joint aspirations of young women and young men together. It's not looking at it in an appropriate way. It's based on misinformation and it's using flawed methodology. Now, to say, okay, we'll let that research go on and now we'll do some research for men, I don't think that's necessarily the most efficient way that we should be going. Maybe some of our research should be spending a bit of time looking at some of these things that are currently happening and say, hey, why are you using all those resources in that way if it's the wrong way to look at these issues? Okay, another illustration, diversity of family types. We hear a heck of a lot about this these days. All sorts of policy direction and approach. We must understand the diversity of family types. It's not just the nuclear family and so on. But what do we actually hear about? A lot of it is in relation to the issue of same-sex couples. Now, I'm nothing for or against same-sex couples, but a lot of the focus is on same-sex couples. So, okay, first of all, 2001, we can get all this info from the census. It's there, sitting there in the tables. 2001, same-sex couples comprised approximately 1% of all couples without children. Of couples with children, less than 1/3 of 1% are same-sex couples. There are approximately 2,200 dependent children in those households. Approximately 667,000 dependent children are in opposite-sex couple households. Now, that doesn't mean that that's mum, dad and the kids. It's a household where you have a man and a woman and the kids. There could well be, for many of those households, a parent and a step-parent and another parent somewhere else, but we still define it as a two-parent household. There are approximately 250,000 dependent children in sole-parent households. Now, they are often called sole-parent families. For most of those children, they have another parent. So, for at least most of those 250,000 children, and arguably for quite a large chunk of the 667,000 children, they are children whose family consists of one parent in one household, another parent in another. Now, if we're talking about diversity of family types, why don't we even have a name for that family type? Okay? So, we have a major policy direction. We are told all the time, don't focus on the natural parents. There's all this diversity of family types, but they are refusing to even name what might be a family type for a very large proportion of the children in our country. And this is a snapshot of one time. There will be plenty more children who are currently living with both their biological parents who at some stage in the future will be in another situation. There is not a name for their family type. This is misinformation. This is misleading. It is not helping us to design sensible policy. Okay. Well, okay. That's it. Now, Suicide. There's been a lot of talk about it. I'll just throw in a little bit. The sort of information that we have on the issue of suicide. On the Ministry of Health website, there's a publication on suicide prepared for the media. Okay? It says suicide and gender. The male-female ratio for suicide in 1996 was 3.8 to 1. Okay, we know more male suicides than female. It varies year by year. But, okay, it's roughly getting around 4 to 1. It goes on. While the rate of suicide is much higher for males, more women attempt suicide. Okay, so you've got this big thing for men, but hey, there's more women attempt suicide. One reason for the gender difference in the rates of suicide may be due to males' choice of more lethal methods of suicide, such as firearms and hanging. Females use methods such as self-poisoning and therefore are much more likely to be found and given life-saving treatment. Females use methods such as self-poisoning and therefore more likely to be given life-saving treatment. Self-poisoning deaths in the year I looked up, in that year, there were 60 female self-poisoning deaths. There were 156 male poisoning deaths. There were more male poisoning deaths than the total number of female suicides. In that, they're talking about firearms and self-poisoning. That level of categorization on deaths in the official statistics, in every single category, there were more male suicide deaths than female. So to argue that there's more male deaths because they choose a different type of suicide simply does not follow. Okay? And yet, we have this release for the media, which to my mind is simply trying to dismiss and belittle male suicide compared to female. Okay? So, again, we have a major problem in terms of the sort of information coming through. The ministry explanation is wrong, the reasoning has been used to downplay male suicide. Okay, what's the point doing research if it's then either distorted or ignored? And it doesn't take long to look at a table of numbers. It doesn't cost $2 million, like at the time you sit back, to look at a table of numbers. Okay. Family violence fatalities. I'm not going to go into a whole load of things about family violence, but there was an issue of family violence, and even here, there's the big concern when we talk family violence, what is it? Men's violence against women. What about children? What about violence against children? Let's remember that. And no one denies the statistic that more of that is by women than by men. And I'm not trying to pin any group or blame any group. I think we should be looking at the issue of violence rather than get into gender politics in anything. Okay? But the issue of violence fatality. Let's try and get some sort of context for this. There are perhaps, just roughly, and I'm actually using something that Steve Mahari, I'll quote from Steve Mahari later, but using some of his approach and looking at the data, there will be maybe year by year, perhaps 10 to 15 adult women fatalities in family violence, due to family violence. How much attention is there about family violence? Any sort of policy area, any time you're trying to say men's issues, men concerns, allow men to be close to their children, so on and so forth, family violence is thrown up. Men are bad, men are violent. How big is this problem? How big is it in our perception? 1996, suicides. 428 males, 128 females. And we've seen other figures for other years. The relative magnitude of deaths by suicide and deaths by family violence, just bear that in mind. ACC work-related fatal injuries, 2001-2002, 18 males, 5 female. This is just giving some idea of the scale. Are we perhaps overplaying the issue of family violence? Are we using it too much to hit men over the head and deny men a chance to play a part and to acknowledge the positive contributions that men might make? Now, Steve Mahari, the speech, 23rd of March this year, and it's very interesting. The heading for this part of his speech was the economic costs of social problems. What social problems? Well, all the suicide side, Is it the problem that all these people might be injured at work and killed at work and so on? No. In New Zealand, half of all female homicides are the result of domestic violence. That is the main focus in his economic cost of social problems. And where does he go for his data? The financial cost of family violence in New Zealand is between $4 and $5 billion, he says. And this is a conservative estimate calculated 10 years ago. Now, where is it coming from? It's coming from a report by Susan Snively at Coopers and Lybrand for what was then the Ministry of Social Welfare. There was a question asked actually, was this report peer-reviewed? Yes, it was peer-reviewed by Coopers and Lybrand in the Ministry of Social Welfare. There was also a question, because there's been various criticism, or there's been criticism of this study come out. They said, are you happy with the quality of work and happy to use the findings from studies like this, given the criticisms that have been raised? His response was, well, it was always intended that there would be lively debate about it, so that's fine. Now, over 10 years after the study came out, he is quoting that finding. He is ignoring the criticisms. Now, what sort of criticisms were there of this study? Is it minor criticism? Well, first of all, in the study, it was assumed all family violence is by men against women and children. In other words, there's no violence by women against men, no violence by women against children. Do you believe that? Okay, so that was the starting assumption in this study. There's actually a whole string of criticisms you could have of it, but just want to highlight the Hamilton Abuse Intervention Pilot Project. That actually gave some information on the injuries and so on. It was, to my mind, violence is bad, yeah, it's always a problem, I don't condone it at all, all the standard disclaimers, but there seemed to be really, compared to the fuss made, there seemed to be very few injuries. If you extrapolate from, say, a population out of about 100,000 people in that area to the whole of New Zealand, it would suggest that maybe there are 60 cases a year of people in New Zealand as a whole requiring dental treatment as a result of family violence. Susan Snively assumed 37,711 cases of dental treatment being needed. But it actually gets a bit worse, 60 compared to 37. It gets worse, because her figures were, that was the cost to government. The government had to pay a share, but then the person going to the dentist also has to pay something. But she said some people knew they were victims of violence, some didn't. Only those who knew they were victims of violence actually paid the private share. Did the others actually go to the dentist? Why didn't they have to pay? And how come they didn't know that they were victims of family violence? These are the sorts of assumptions that led to those figures in that model. And despite the criticisms and the problems with the study that he knows about, he is still using that figure. Now, when you say do research, what is the point? Why is that original research done in that way? Is that acceptable, or is it a waste of money? Why bother doing the research saying this study isn't really that good if these people are still, year after year, going to keep giving us those same figures? We will have very poor debate unless the quality information actually goes into public debate. Okay, one point I'll just throw in just to highlight something else that maybe we should be concerned about. We hear a lot about sole parent families. The idea that, if you adjust for economic things, they're no worse than all sorts of other family types, so on and so forth. So they are just as good. We should be supporting all different types of family. Personally, I think a sole parent family is a misnomer anyway. I think it's highly offensive to say to the other parent, you no longer exist except for child support. And we don't even acknowledge your parenting input, even if you're putting half of the time. I think that's a highly offensive approach to take. And when they talk about how are men viewed in society, most of the people who are left out there are men. But there's also just going to, anybody, any of you could go to the Statistics New Zealand website now, click a few buttons through their table builder stuff, and get this information. There's a table in the paper, but the particular point, 1998, for sole parents with dependent children only. Some have dependent and adult children, some have just adult children. So this is the category. Those sole parents with dependent children, in 1998, 59% of their income came from government. We have a government pushing the idea of economic independence for women. It seems to inflation. It rose by just over 12% when inflation was just under 10. But for certain other groups, such as your couples with dependent children, first of all, their money coming from government transfers was about 6% and then 3%. They are far more self-funding. And there could be wide variation within these, but just if on average 59% was from government transfers, for some it's a heck of a lot more, and for others it's less. But also, for these latter group, couples with dependent children, their income increased by 30 to 40% over that 5-year period. So we have a family type that is highly dependent on government and whose income has not been keeping up with various other family groups. Does this signal a potential problem for us? Very probably it does. We are concerned, we have a lot of debate about retirement, the number of old people, how are we going to support all these old people? How are we going to support this so-called family type? There's an issue there. You just have to click on the numbers and it's there. But where are we bringing that into policy debate? So I think there's something quite serious there. Okay, now I'll get into some of the things. If we're going to do research on men, what are the sorts of issues? If I were to be asked to identify characteristics that distinguish the current policy environment from the sort of thing in the past, I think high on my list will be the lack of regard for relationships between children and their fathers. I can say that from personal experience as well. I think there is appalling lack of regard for the relationship between children and their fathers. And I'll even say, without any wishing to offend any of the speakers here today, there are plenty of speakers who are prepared to say that fathers really either aren't or haven't done that much for their kids. And I think if you look at some of the history on this sort of thing, I think a lot of that is actually misrepresented as well. And there's some very telling information on roles between fathers and children 200, 300, 500 years ago. That would say, in all sorts of ways, fathers were very committed, and why should they be any emotionally different from fathers now? Fathers are very concerned about their children, and always have been. But I really do think that's a serious issue, and in that context, I think some of these issues might merit attention for research. Men in custody. We still don't have data on the award of custody to men and women, the divide of the award of custody, either through courts or by other arrangements, or more generally the way parenting is split between fathers and mothers when children are apart. In addition, when we're defining what parenting is, it's come so much from the mother nurturing sort of role, rather than saying to what extent is just a father's presence important, or the fact that there is a man in the household who is bringing in the money rather than it coming from the taxpayer, or a whole range of other things that may make a father important or a mother important, not just what tasks are they doing, who's buying the food and whatever, but what is the significance of a parent to a child, and are we facilitating that? Non-custodial parents and alienation. I am surprised, mildly, at the lack of awareness, even now, by so many people about the issue of parental alienation and what parental alienation actually means. You get, if a child is alienated from a parent, according to all this literature, you find there are irrational, unjustified reasons given for the dislike for the parent, for refusal to go and see the parent, and so on, for a whole range of reasons, feeling they have to ally with the other parent who's in conflict, a whole range of issues. It's damaging, very damaging for the child, it's very painful and damaging for the other parent, and arguably the alienating parent is not helping them either. This is potentially, to me, a major social issue. These people grow up and they still have that baggage with them and they have to deal with it. And I'm sure there are counsellors in this room who are dealing with people 40 years old trying to come to terms with that sort of experience they had in their childhood. and yet it's still not really acknowledged. We don't know the scale of the problem, we don't know what can be done to limit the harmful effects, how to prevent it happening, how to undo the effects once it has actually occurred. More needs to be done on this. DNA, misattribution of paternity. Now, we don't have an accurate figure. Again, it's something people really haven't actually looked into that much. There's a whole range of different figures, rough ballpark that seems to come up. Well, I was quoted at 10% on the front page of the Sunday Star Times, but God knows quite where it came from. But I said, if you want to figure out about 10%, so then the Law Commission said, yes, 10%. And I even saw on, Lord Winston, isn't it? He said 10%. I'm sure it wasn't because I said it, but anyway. That figure seems to be floating around. 400,000 people in New Zealand have the wrong idea as to who their father is. Is that a problem for them? For their fathers? The fact that there's that likelihood of having the wrong idea, how many of you know for certain who your father is? Does it matter? With your kids, to what extent are you sure that they are your kids? Does it matter? We have now, with DNA paternity testing, a way to know for sure. It might mean for a lot of relationships, if there's doubts and uncertainty, that can all be clarified and the relationship can be stronger. Or if there's the wrong person, there's a chance to find the actual person who's the father. Or at least to identify that there's a difficulty there. Now, we have instead a marked reluctance. We had, what was it, in the report on paternity from the Law Commission. That came out just the other day. 2 o'clock, the report was released. 3 o'clock, the media was saying, we want a quote from you. A 200-page report. 1 hour later, they want a quote. Okay, so by the next day I had 8 points, and I said, okay, here are my 8 points. No, we don't have time for that. We'll use one, we'll put it out of context. Here's the... This, and after 2 days, it's no longer a news issue. This is how the public get their impressions of these major social issues. And then they vote for different parties on the basis of that. This is rubbish. Remember what I said at the beginning, what research is done and the dissemination of the information. We need quality debate with quality information. What they say in there, they should try to minimise misattribution of paternity, getting the wrong father. What do? Well, there's no point DNA testing at birth or generally DNA testing. We'll actually broaden the presumption of paternity from not just married husbands to any male living in the household when a child's born. Basically, take back their relationships and civil unions as well, without the test. So they're actually moving further away from identifying who the real father is, while saying we've got to minimise misattribution. So, is it convincing? No, it's not. It's not a logical argument at all, as far as I can see. Men and work-life balance. The male dimension really has to be explored in this. The number of times you see politicians saying this is a woman's issue. Even if it's a woman's issue, there are men involved in solving it, and you've got to look at men and their perspectives to resolve that. The whole gendered approach to policy and analysis and research has caused no end of trouble in giving us a highly slanted perspective on most of these issues, and we are paying the price. Wasted time and effort in research and misdirected policies. Major problem, future for young men. So much you can see for girls and women about what their options are, what they can expect. So are they encouraged to do this, encouraged to do that? You ask young men, what is your future? What do you see your future? Or you ask political parties, what are the options for young men in this country? You've got the agenda for women saying, hey, go for it, you can have career, family, everything else. What can young men expect? Can they expect to have a family and a lifelong relationship with their children? Because that is not the experience that probably they have had with their fathers and many adult men that they have seen have with their children. So what are these expectations? Have they given any thought to this at all? And it's my impression that maybe this will be the first election that I have seen since all this feminist stuff has come through, that there may actually start to be a focus, maybe this summit today will help with it, there may actually start to be a focus on men and men's concerns. Now, if to take away from what I've said today, if there are just 2 thoughts I'd like you to get away with, that's gone. Okay, 2 thoughts I'd like you to take away with you. One, we really do not know that much. So much of the information coming out is not solid information. It's not backed information. There's biased research, distorted research, research that hasn't been done, numbers that have been plucked out of the air, family violence and so on. We don't know that much. If you don't know that much, you cannot do that much. All these policy interventions going on without a clue what the real situation is and what the effects of those interventions will be. We can cause untold damage if we're not actually looking at those issues. So let's be aware, when anybody stands up and says they have all the answers, they know the issues, they do not. What we do have is, in some areas, a lot of very simple information, such as I've shown you today, that can indicate quite clearly we have the wrong perspective. Now, the first point, we don't know that much. The second point is more a question. What future are we offering young men? I really think we should think about it.